The baby boomers were the most idealistic generation in American history, but they were also the most narcissistic. And those two things are connected because the baby boomers thought they were on the side of virtue. They tended not to be terribly restrained in their ambitions. Just as the baby boomers think of themselves as the generation that discovered sex, they also thought they were the first generation in American history that ever wanted to make the world a better place or that ever had any respect for third world cultures. Of course, hubris leads to tragedy, as the Greeks taught us, and this yielded, in the case of the boomers, a sort of hybrid monster of humanitarian war and a naive American imperialism that was in many cases worse than the proper kinds of empire that it displaced. The folly of good intentions and the ability of good intentions to lead you astray. The number one theme of baby boomer foreign policy was anti-imperialism. The boomers, it's funny, empire has been the most common form of government throughout human history. And then all of a sudden in the 20th century, America decided that it should be comprehensively prohibited for all time, that empire was in its nature offensive and should not be allowed. But the problem was that we didn't always have a good idea for what should succeed empire, for what should come next. That was true after World War II, when America did its best to dismantle the British and French empires, and the consequence was a Cold War squabble over the newly independent nations. And it's equally true of foreign policy in the age of the boomers, when the boomers entered their 40s and 50s and attained the positions at the summit of power starting in the 1990s. Then, too, they tended to meddle in other countries without much thought for the kinds of compromises that would be necessary and the kinds of reconciliation with reality that they would have to learn to tolerate in order to be able to leave these countries once they'd entered them. I have an entire chapter in my book all about Jeffrey Sachs, the famous economist at Harvard and now at Columbia, because he is, to my mind, a truly quintessential baby boomer. He's someone who believes that we could, he's someone who believed that we could eradicate extreme poverty in Africa. Not just alleviate it, but eradicate it. And that's such a perfect example of the combination of boomer idealism and hubris. But whatever you want to say about Jeffrey Sachs, he was invited to every country he went to. It was sovereign governments who thought that they could benefit from the services of a Harvard-trained economist. And whatever imperial aspects there were to Jeffrey Sachs's career, you certainly can't say that he went where he wasn't wanted. That is not the case of today's millennial activists. In the case of the farm protests in India, you recently saw Greta Thunberg get called out for posting essentially a script for the protest maneuver in order to undermine the Modi government, which is all well and good for Indians to want to, protest the deeds of their government, although in this case the farm laws are perfectly fine. But it's quite another thing for international organizations to throw their considerable weight behind protest movements intended to undermine a democratically elected leader. And in this case, a poll that was recently done showed that more than 3/4 of Indians support Modi's handling of these protests. So it's not only arrogant for international organizations to be throwing their weight behind protest movements in India, it's also a little bit undemocratic. This is a common misconception. President Biden was actually born during World War II, which makes him technically a pre-boomer. And not just technically, he's also a pre-boomer spiritually. He still uses antiquated slang like malarkey. That's not a very baby boomer thing to do. He's from the generation preceding, both in birth date and in spirit. And I think that comes out in his foreign policy as well. The baby boomers are a generation of blarney, of high-flown idealistic rhetoric, of speechifying that sounds good. And while it's true that the president is a man who does like the sound of his own voice, he also has an admirable ability or an admirable willingness to cut through blarney and ask really basic questions, even if those questions sound stupid. Questions like, what are we even doing in Afghanistan? Why are we stuck in the same old ruts? Why can't we get out of them if they're not doing us any good? Sometimes this willingness to ask stupid questions leads him to outside the box thinking that is maybe not especially helpful, as some of his interventions in Iraq proved to be. But I have a lot of hope that his willingness to cut through blarney, boomer blarney specifically, will serve him well in extracting America from some of its more ill-advised entanglements.